Hello, sinners. Welcome to another episode of Sin on the Go, our podcast. I'm Teresa Wallace, and today I have a new friend with me. I'm so excited. This is Amelia Behrens. Amelia, introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Amelia Behrens. I'm a special education teacher, and I specialize in early childhood special education, autism spectrum disorder, and developmental cognitive disabilities. I've been teaching for 16 years across Michigan and in Minnesota, and I work with our teacher apprenticeship program and do some adjunct at a university in Minnesota, and I have a real passion for working with teachers.
Fabulous. That's a big reason why we're all here, right? We want to support all the adults who are supporting all of our students that we love so much. So what are we talking about today?
We're talking about shifting mental models. As I think about how we shape pre-teachers who are getting into the career for the first time or teachers who have been around for a long time, one of the things that comes up for me is, what is that individual's mental model?
Okay, so thinking about mental models, thinking about special education, I think there's a lot of language and a lot of fast-paced decisions, a lot of high stakes, limited time, all of the things in that space, a lot of acronyms, a lot of just words that we use that we may not even understand all of the history of why we're using them and how that's impacting ourselves, our actions with using those things. What do you think about in that space?
There's a lot to hold cognitively. There's a lot on a teacher's plate, especially in special education. And so the thing that we're going to talk about with mental models today is not an opportunity to call out folks, but it's an attempt to call folks in to notice, reflect, and think about how we can shift the way that we're thinking and behaving to best impact our students and also to best impact ourselves.
Mm-hmm. This year is 50 years with IDEA in federal code, which is huge and amazing, but also special ed has continuously and should be a model of continuous improvement, right? I mean,
Yes.
We think about MTSS, we think about all these other things, but mental models is another one of those things, right? You think about not being stuck, and you think about being able to have to name that and recognize it in order to change it. And special ed is another one of those places where you need to be able to identify something in order to change it.
And mental models are a natural process. That's something that our brains do to take shortcuts, to think efficiently, to have a frame of reference. And so our mental models are shaped by our experiences and our observations, and they're reinforced by what people say and how things kind of play out. But what they do is they also shape our underlying beliefs and then in turn shape our actions. And so by being mindful of what our mental models are framed up as in our brains, we can have impact on our environment, our students, our actions, and all of those other pieces.
All right, so we're just going to jump right in. We're going to talk about several sections of things today. So the first part is the words that shaped us. So how we engage based on the things that we have experienced in the past, and how those things impact our students and the other adults. Special education is full of other adults, and I always think about me and my experience as now an administrator, but when I was in the classroom, I was an adult in a Fed 8, which means that I had more adults than I had students. I had 8 adults to 7 students, which I know blows people's minds, and that is not the norm. But ultimately, I had so many adults that we all had to be consistent. We had to have so many touch points all the time. We had classroom meetings every single day, because if we were not exactly on the same page for every single student we were serving, it did not work, right? So
definitely
thinking about in our classrooms that we serve in our more intensive settings, you still have a huge number of adults, both related services and administrators and our non-licensed staff, that we need to be explicitly communicating with as the licensed staff. what our expectations are, what is the language, what is the culture of the classroom, what are we using when we are talking about students, what does that look like?
Exactly. And I think to begin with, we have to think about how people talked about us. You know, if we're talking to a huge group of educators, probably someone described you as being a leader. They described you as being probably talkative or inclusive or whatever. Those positive things impacted your career choice probably. But the opposite can be true as well. And so when people say things about folks, maybe they're chatty or dramatic or non-compliant or lazy or manipulative or attention seeking, that can also have the opposite effect on those folks who those words are being used about.
Yeah, when you put those stereotypes into play, you really think about who are you picturing,
Yep.
which then becomes part of the equity work of what you're thinking about, but also you as a school, you as a district, like what is your mission? What is your goal? How are you describing the students that you serve? And what is your language convention that you are trying to shape as a group of learners and how you show up at school every day?
Absolutely. And so if we think about what did those words do to us in our history, so if somebody described me as being a behavior problem or behind, how did that then impact or shape my education and what I think of myself today? And we remember those bad things. They stick almost more loudly in our brain than some of the positive things that happened to us. And so what does that do to our students?
Even the things that for me were less academic, because I am a high achiever. I am one of those people who did not like getting anything other than an A. I also am the seventh of 8 siblings, which meant I was late a lot by things that were not circumstances that I could control, because we had 2 cars. My dad took one to work and my mom was doing the other one. That meant she was my Uber driver and very happy about it. But it meant that I did a lot of waiting and then was late. So one of the words that described me a lot was late. And it made me crazy because I couldn't control it, but it was a word used to describe my behavior.
Yep.
And I did not like it. And so now I'm perpetually early because it makes me nuts. So like if I'm less than 10 minutes early, I'm late. Like I'm one of those people, but it's based out of anxiety of like what people are going to think about me based on my experience.
Absolutely. So those words shaped you and the way that you the way that you grew up, the way that you now act as an adult. And so when I think about the words we're using that shape our students, or we're talking about our students, this shapes the staff and how the staff are talking about that student as well. What are their preconceived notions and perceptions of that student based on the language that we are choosing to use? How are then their parents talking about them? And then it teaches that student themselves how to think of themselves. So those words have big power.
Yeah. I think about all of the unintended norms that we're creating as the adults.
Absolutely.
Even just that example of what I said, and you think about like our Fed 3 students who are going into a gen ed classroom and what you as maybe a paraprofessional or the non-licensed staff that might be supporting them in that space, like how are we prepping them to go into that space? And what does that look like when we are shaping their thoughts and behaviors as they're engaging in that space, rather than teaching them how to be an observer to engage in that space, to learn how to engage and choose based on what's happening in the space rather than the adult's interpretation of what's happening in the space with that language.
It's definitely shaping the neurodiverse outlook we have on our students, where we're relying on those preconceived notions, that mental model or a frame of that student versus what they're showing us right now, and using our critical thinking skills to then shape the way that we interact with that student in that moment.
We're like asking the student, how do you want to show up in this space? What do you want them to see?
Yeah, gaining their voice and choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think about, especially special ed, there are a lot of words that have been used. It is a system built on deficit-based language.
Yep.
It is a system that has done a lot of harm in how it engages out of the necessity of the legal jargon that is used. And that does not mean we have to live in that language with how we are verbalizing it, both in spaces with students and in spaces with adults in the cultures of our classrooms.
Yeah.
Can you speak to a little bit about that and what you think about the impact of that language and what that looks like?
In the teacher apprenticeship program and in those pre-teaching classes, we have to frame up what eligibility looks like. And the definitions that are out there federally and statewide are very, like you said, deficit driven. And so one of the things we talk about in those classes is that the language you want to use when you are writing an IEP, when you're writing a progress report, when you're talking to your staff, when you're talking to families? How do you change what those things look like at the federal or the state level? And how do you put them into different context or different words to have better mental models, to have better beliefs, thoughts, and actions about students and with students? Because how we talk when we are with students impacts their perception of themselves.
So like really thinking about the impact that you want to have and reflecting, you have to be aware of it
Growth mindset.
before you can do anything about it. And I think about like the culture that we have on the teams that I support and the teams that I lead, and the expectation to call each other out, or at least being willing to do that one-on-one, let alone in a larger space. Like, I expect you to name something to me if I said something that you're like, ooh, that's not great. Maybe think about that. And I think not every team has that as an expectation or as a place where you have that relationship with each other, but you've got to start somewhere.
And I think some people think about that as like moving in a direction of being overly, quote, politically correct. And I would argue that we are using the language that is most received by the group of people that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And those folks should have voice, choice, and they need to name how they would like to be talked about, and then that's the norm that we're following. So if, for example, like the term nonverbal, if that's a word that we're using to describe students, does that mean they have no verbalizations? Is non-speaking a more descriptive term of their communication skills? How do they want to be referenced and referred to in regards to their communication skills? You know, I think about high and low functioning as well. You know, that categorizes students into two opposite sides of the pendulum, you know, and that's not very supportive of understanding that student, or it puts them in a box.
And what do you think about? You immediately think about IQ and ability for academics, like immediately. And I think about my two nephews, and one of them has a DCD label with SD and one of them does not. And they were both called high functioning because the doctors and the teachers at the time where one of them was diagnosed didn't want to play the game with my brother and his wife talking about these labels and offend them and say that he did or didn't have these skills related to an intellectual disability. The label had no bearing related to a skill. That it was just language. It was a game to engage in this conversation around his skills, and it still sticks, right? So it is now this language frame. They're like, well, high function. And I was like, that it's not helpful. It's counterproductive when you start getting into the discussion of what they need and what their goals are, and where that's landing, and it's getting in the way of the conversation, and it's putting me in a mental frame that's like, oh, you can do these things. Why?
And never the other things.
Right.
So when he's in that box, when we put our students in that box of being verbal or nonverbal, or high or low functioning, or even like the words we use when we write notes home to parents, like this was a good day or a bad day, I would venture a guess that there's glimmers, you know, or even moments or extended periods of time where those things were not all bad, right? Where we are, if we contextualize a student as being low functioning, like you said, we're thinking about their IQ, but we're also putting them in a box and saying, well, they're never going to get to these other things, or they're never going to achieve higher than whatever level we're imagining. And those are extraordinarily limiting beliefs that then in turn impact the way that we behave in our classrooms. And that is powerful.
Yeah, it comes down to kind of like a quality of life rating.
Absolutely.
Right? And it's like, why?
Yeah.
Can't you flip that into language that is strength-based, related to the conversation that you are having. Listen to the student and family voice. If that language speaks to them in a way that is meaningful, use it, right? Because that is something that they personally find meaningful, they identify with it. Use it and quote that in your report, right? This is family and student named vernacular, and use that and repeat that interview and make sure that it is accurate each time you meet with that family, because that changes over time as well. But then it's not you superimposing these words into a space. And a lot of times, I don't know about you, but in my experience, the families are taking their cues from us, right? Or from the other professionals. And I think the more we are asking them about how they want to be termed, what language they feel like, they will feel more empowered to choose language that feels right for them.
And using that, you know, when we as educators shift our mental models that are built over time, then we're able to help impact those other adults, right? Like you talked about, there's mass quantities of adults in special education. Our teams are huge, IEPs of 20 or more people. Yeah. And so how do we use language to impact those folks to be more detailed, more specific, more descriptive about student skills, needs, goals, abilities, all of those pieces? We have to shift our mental models. We have to change what that looks like.
All right. These are like mic drop moments. Let's just I'm sweating. Okay. I love talking about topics that we're passionate about, and I think that's what this podcast is for. Okay. So I'm going to deep breathe for a minute. All right. So mental models and how they form. So it's not just a one and done, right? Like you could hear me talking about like my nephew, who is now 27.
I worked with him, so that's hard to hear.
Right? I have been in the field for 21 years. It is something, I mean, he has been seminal in my experience. So his experience has shaped my experience over time, and I will use him as a reference point throughout my life. I know I will. And several of my nieces and nephews, that is the case for education, right? Like they're exemplars in my brain that I will go back to. But mental models are shifting. They are not fixed or permanent. That is based on your experience in the moment and your reflection, if you are willing to identify it and look at it and like live in that space and intentionally choose to shift.
Yep. And I think about a mental model as being like a picture frame that you're looking at the world through. And that picture frame, like we mentioned before, is set up based on how have you lived your life so far? Where did you grow up? How did your parents and family interact with you? What types of interactions did you have with peers as a child, as a high schooler, as a college student? What kind of norms were in your friend groups? And then what experience have you had as a teacher? Where did you go to school? What was your teacher prep program like? Did you have a really great cooperating teacher? And then as you entered the field, what did that look like? And how many times have you experienced like mass burnout, significant burnout, and what did that do to you? And I think that really shapes that frame that you are then looking at reality through. And everybody has one, right? Those are our beliefs, our biases, our experiences.
Another piece in there would be like your racial autobiography, right?
Absolutely.
Like how you've experienced race and inequity or not
in
your life and culture. Yep.
Absolutely. When you are aware and you kind of go through and do like an inventory of yourself, we tend to seek out other frames that confirm what we are looking at through our frame, right? I'm looking for other people who agree with me.
We do love a good confirmation bias
Absolutely,
entry point, don't we?
It causes us to miss, though, some things that may challenge our beliefs. And being, like you said, on teams that will maybe call you out, but also gently lead you towards understanding and seeing many different perspectives and many different ways of life, many different races and cultures and ways of being. This is a human condition. This is the way that we are. It's not a moral failing. Like, we're not failing as educators, but as we shift our mental model, as we become more aware of the way that we show up in spaces and what language we're using, we're going in that direction of a growth mindset. We're not fixed. We're willing to change. Yep. They're not permanent.
So we love research. As a team, as a podcast body, we are going to quote research as much as is humanly possible because it's a space that is important to be aware of. What does research say about this area, right? What do you got for us?
I think a lot of research comes from Carol Dweck, who wrote about grit and growth mindset. Those pieces and a strength-based approach are going to boost engagement and achievement for students. And that's a big deal. Strengths-based approaches lead to greater happiness and academic engagement and academic success and persistence in challenges. Strengths-based language can foster a growth mindset, help students develop resiliency and self-efficacy. Positive educator and student interactions, especially when that language is strengths-based, it can improve outcomes, meaning we are going to enhance motivation, improve behavior, and academic performance, especially for our students who may be at risk. One of the things that really stuck with me is that a strengths-based approach promotes inclusion and self-determination. And that's what we strive for. That's the mountain we stand on as special education teachers. And this is especially impactful for those students with disabilities, increasing their engagement and their advocacy, which is going to improve their outcomes well into adulthood.
We do talk about those areas a lot in relation to special education students, self-advocacy being, an area that we will analyze and evaluate and test, right? But are we seeking those additional spaces where we can gather student voice and give them avenues to advocate what their goals are on a regular basis in the classroom, right? Are we seeking those out, not just for an eval or an annual IEP? And because they are inherently students who have identified needs, they are more vulnerable to direction from others and that superseding, overarching kind of control that is making them a more vulnerable population in a lot of ways. And I think that's a challenge to reflect on as the adults who have the power in that space, like being aware of that, being aware of what language you can empower these students with. Like that self-determination piece, when you think about it, combined with self-advocacy, combined with independence, where are areas that you can intentionally be supporting the student to increase those ways, right? To increase those language frames around, I can do this, I can do it better. What do you want to learn and grow and be more independent in right now?
Yep.
Right? There are always avenues for all of our students to be more independent, to gain voice and space and skills. And I think sometimes we don't think about it enough as an avenue to gain a lot of other skills in those spaces, and there's a lot of opportunity there for our students.
Absolutely. One of the things I talk about with the pre-teachers that I work with is that teaching isn't telling. Like, I want my students to have all these skills. I can tell them all day long what these skills are. I can describe in detail how to grow your self-advocacy, to be independent, to take risks, to accept feedback. And those kids continue to struggle with those skills. They continue to have difficulty getting feedback on papers, getting feedback in the moment, trying something that might be challenging for them. And so in reframing our mental models and using strength-based language, we are able to model and demonstrate belonging, dignity, problem-solving skills, risk-taking, all of those different pieces. And we're promoting, like you said, equity, right? We're improving collaboration amongst our peers, and then we're going to help that student grow their sense of confidence. And that's a big deal. That makes a big impact on those students in their lives.
That risk-taking was one that I immediately was thinking about. Like, we talk about risk-taking not enough with students who have special ed needs, because you, and meaning me, I can get into a protective mode, especially for students with more intensive needs or behavioral needs. Like, I don't want them to fail. Yep. But failure or an area where they are more likely to have an opportunity to fail or to not be as successful as we want them to be, right? Thinking about that strength-based model of reframing that opportunity for them. There is so much learning there, right?
Learning
like,
happens
or
in the zone of proximal
mitigate it so
development.
that maybe they are not like failing at an epic level, but maybe just a little bit, or maybe a little bit more. Maybe you're allowing some of that space to exist for students where maybe you haven't allowed it to exist as much in the past. And what does that look like? Right? I think that there's so much value for our students in living in some of that space. Yes, it can still have some protections to it, depending on what that looks like for your students and talking about it with students and families, but there's a lot of learning in that space.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We all remember those opportunities where we have bombed. You've been up and done public speaking, or you embarrassed yourself in front of your high school class by saying something incorrectly, and you'll never say it that way again. And so the zone of proximal development lives in early childhood, so that's something that comes up for me a lot. But that's where students are slightly uncomfortable, right? They're slightly challenged, and they're going to retain that information much better and commit it to their long-term memory. And that's what we really want to do.
All right, sinners. As you can tell, Amelia and I did not finish that conversation. We spent about an hour talking about that, and our podcast is not supposed to be an hour long, so we split it into 2 parts. You'll have to come back for part 2. In the meantime, be well. We'll talk soon. See you later, sinners.